We have been talking about love. Turn to somebody next to you and say, love. Okay. Say it like you mean it, you know. My name is Jean. Jean, it's French, and I know all about love. We're finishing our series on 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And what we've been trying to do, by the way, is to take 1 Corinthians out of the quicksand of romanticism, you know, and just because love is something that we are to have all the time, not just at weddings. It's something we are to love always. Okay? And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the last few verses in this chapter of 1 Corinthians chapter 13, where Paul both reiterates and he expands his desperate attempt to get the 1 Corinthians church to pay attention on how important love is. Because what he's saying to them, you've got all of these spiritual gifts, you know how to prophesy, you know how to speak in funny languages, and all of these other things. But the one area you're lacking in is love. And that is the most important thing. That is what determines your maturity, not all of these other things. Okay? In 1 Corinthians chapter 13, this passage is listed by many commentators as being the most misunderstood and misused passage in the entire New Testament. The good news is, great learning happens when you realize you have a word in your mind and that you don't really understand it rightly and you don't really understand the depth of it. So I think the potential that we have here this morning to understand love is huge. Okay? The church was a mess in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. They were an absolute mess. Sexual sins, pride, divisions, idols. And what Paul is asking for here in this chapter is for them to understand that he's not looking for behavioral modification. He's not looking for external change to happen and for them to comply with by just changing their outward behavior. He's saying, for an internal shift. Okay, where they really understand God's love in a deep way so that the behaviors change as a result of what's happened on the inside. We're going to look at these last few verses, and we're going to start off by reading them out aloud together. So, are you ready to read this with me today? Yes. I might have to borrow this mic just so that we can read it together. So, let's read this. Okay, Sophie, are you ready? Love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part and we prophesy in part. But when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. So now, faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love.
Well done for keeping up with him.
Well done. Let's look at what Paul is trying to communicate with these last few verses in this crescendo chapter of the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 13. The first thing Paul is trying to get us to understand is that, number one, love is supreme. There's something that happens when you get to the essence or the internal center of something. You'll find its intrinsic nature, which is the indispensable quality of something that determines its very character. What Paul is saying in so many ways is that at the center of who God is, guys, is love.
Amen.
And everything else emanates out of that. When you strip away what is non-essential from anything and you dig deep enough to find out what is irreducible in the universe and in the nature of God, it's love.
Yes.
I used to watch a TV show called Gold Rush. Anybody ever watched that show? There it is there. Okay, and it's about these few families in Canada, in the Yukon area, mining for gold. And they turn up ground with their diggers, and they get deep enough to something called the permafrost. I think I've got a picture of it there. There it is there. Permafrost, which is a layer of iced ground, and they start to dig a little more and then use their heavy equipment to get down deep to that level, and then they take that dirt and they put it into sluice boxes. There it is there. Where water washes over the dirt, and what gets trapped in these special mats, go back, Sophie, what gets trapped in these special mats is gold. Gold dust, gold nuggets, okay? And in the old days, you can go to the next one, Sophie, they used to pan for gold. There it is there. They used to go to the river or get some dirt from somewhere and put it in the pan, and you would fill the metal pan with dirt. They used to call that pay dirt, okay? And when you looked at the dirt, you would see nothing of value in it. You'd see nothing of value in it, but slowly over time, if you are patient, and if you moved the pan in a certain way and held it at a certain angle, and you started to move that water over the dirt, what would be left would be the gold. The next one, Soph. Thank you. Nothing but dirt, and then over a little bit of time, with a little bit of patience, then getting little glimpses of glitter. Okay? And pretty soon, taking the leftover flakes and putting them in a bottle. You know, and these guys from Gold Rush would take their bottle and eventually go to the metal man, the gold man, who would then melt it into a gold bar, removing the impurities, and then pay them what was due to them. Okay? You'd put them in the bottle because what you've done was you've gone through everything that obscured and competed with the gold, and you found what was most valuable. That's the treasure. And in these verses, Paul is saying in the chapter before he gave the Corinthians a vision of what the church was supposed to be like, different from how they were behaving, that people with the gift of administration, he says, who were gifted by God to take chaos and bring order out of it, and people with the gift of giving were motivated to give over and above what the rest could give to help other people. And people with the gift of teaching should teach, and prayer warriors should pray. And then he says in this chapter, he says, when all of those things pass away, what is left is love. Let's read verse 8, 9, and 10, and I'll read them for you. It says, love never ends. Paul says, as for the gift of prophecy, that will pass away. For those of you who have the gift of tongues, that too will cease. For those of you who bring great knowledge to the church, that will pass away. We know right now only in a partial glimpse, and we prophesy, and we use our gifts only to a certain level. But when the perfect comes, that means when God comes, and when we understand the irreducible center of God as love, the partial will pass away, and we will be left with what is most important. And Paul is reminding us desperately to understand, and not just to the church at Corinth, but to us, guys, that love is what is remaining when everything else you care about so much is gone. Yeah? That fancy watch you might have, those nice trainers that you might have, when all of that stuff is gone, love. The second thing Paul is trying to get us to understand in this passage is, number 2, love is personal. Something happens uniquely in verse 11 that shows us this. Let me read verse 11 to you. Paul now says this. He says, when I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. Why is this verse so critical? Paul changes it from saying, do you understand what the spiritual gifts are? Do you understand what love is? He changes it you to I. It's as though Paul is letting us in on a secret. He changes it to the first person plural here. And it's like he's saying, let me show you beforehand, let me show you what my before and after picture was. Right? Let me remind you of what I was like before I understood love. And let me remind you of what kind of person I have become, who can pen the words of 1 Corinthians chapter 13 to get you to understand the transformational power of love. Acts chapter 7, if you go back and read that, when the early church was just getting started, there was a man named Stephen. And Stephen gave a dramatic and moving sermon in the marketplace. He wasn't even in church, guys. He was out there. And he was preaching out there somewhere in the marketplace. And it's one of the longest sermons recorded in the Bible. Excuse me, I think it's longer than anything Jesus ever preached. And I need to remind myself that it was less than 30 minutes. Okay, so that's a good place to shoot for, right? In this sermon, he gives the arc of God in history over time. And he ends it with the power of Jesus. Then, as any good preacher does, at the end of the sermon, he brings it to the point of conviction. And he says to everybody who's listening to him, and that includes the religious leaders who were there too, right? Who it says, secretly instigated against him, stirring up the people and setting up false witnesses against Stephen. And after they listened to this entire sermon of the work of God over time, and it was so compelling if you read it, Stephen says directly to them, this is what he says: you stiff-necked people who resist the Holy Spirit, you must stop persecuting. And then he calls them to repentance. In fact, it says when they heard these words, they were so overjoyed. They were jumping. No, it says they were enraged. They ground their teeth at him. I don't know if I've ever done that. But man, you must be seriously cross to be doing that. They ground their teeth at him. They cried with a loud voice and plugged their ears as they rushed to him so that they didn't have to listen to him saying anything anymore. And they pulled him out of the city and they stoned him. And then in the very next verse in chapter 8, there's a shadowy figure watching all of this happening. And it says, Saul approved of Stephen's execution. Saul, who became Paul, who wrote 1 Corinthians chapter 13, that's quite a transformation. The rest of the passage goes on to describe that Paul was ravaging the church. He was dragging men and women into the street and off to prison. He was breathing threats and murder against the disciples of Jesus. That was Saul, who became a man who could write all the beautiful words of 1 Corinthians chapter 13 for us to understand what love is. What happened? Well, he met Jesus. Yeah. And not long after the description of what he was doing to persecute the followers of Jesus, he was alone on a road. I think it was the road to Damascus, and he heard an audible voice where Jesus said to him, "Why are you persecuting me?" And there was a transaction between the two of them, and Saul, for a moment, lost his vision and had a transformation where he believed in Jesus. And over time, the disciples hesitantly, and for good reason they were hesitantly pulled him away into a home, took care of him until his sight was restored, and then very carefully introduced him to the other disciples to consider the possibility that Jesus had so transformed this man and that he would be invited in the ensuing chapters to join Barnabas and others and lead the first missionary journeys, missionary trips outside of Jerusalem and Samaria, and spread the gospel to the known world. It's one of my favorite things to do, Nikki will tell you, is to study that aspect of the church. What changes somebody from Saul to Paul? It's this love that he's talking about in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, guys. For Paul, this was not theoretical. It was absolutely, utterly, compellingly, it had changed him. When you think about Acts chapter 8, 9, and 10, and you read 1 Corinthians chapter 13, you are in the presence of what is possible when somebody encounters this kind of earth-shattering, soul-changing love. And then Paul goes on to say, this love that I'm asking you to understand is not just supreme, which makes it most valuable and core. It's not just personal, but it's eternal. It's eternal. It's what we will go into eternity learning more and more about. In verse 13, Paul says this toward the end of the chapter. He says, "So now, faith, hope, and love abide. But these amazing virtues and values, but the greatest of these, the one that lasts, is love." What does that mean for our own journey to understand love? I think we need to go back and look at the life of Jesus. Okay? During the four Gospels, when Jesus was trying not to teach us, but to show us what it means to love, there are three distinctions, I think, that take love out of the category of just a good, warm feeling, fuzzy feeling toward people who are like us. It takes us out of the hallmark moment and makes it actionable enough to change somebody like Saul to Paul. Yeah? The first thing Jesus did, so striking when Jesus began his earthly ministry, was that he did not start by setting foot in the religious institutions. Yeah? Didn't start by setting foot in the religious institutions. He did not start by going and finding the religious leaders and having conversations with them. He didn't. He started speaking to and being able and being with all the people whom the religious leaders deemed to be marginalized and sinners, the unacceptable. Those are the people that he spent time with. Jesus began on the edges, and Jesus said the edge is the center. Those of you who are in the center are so mistaken. It got to the point when the religious leaders criticized Jesus by saying, "Isn't he the one who hangs out with sinners and tax collectors and prostitutes?" To which Jesus said, "Yes, that would be me." Right? Why? Because that's how far the love of God goes. In fact, maybe a better way to say it is that's where the love of God starts. I'm guessing if you're like me, for all of us in this room, we have a group of people who are in our minds who are the marginalized ones. I'm guessing it's different for each person, but who is that for you? Who's the kind of person and what condition, you can fill in the blank, for you that you consider on the margins? Perhaps God's call for you and I on this journey to understand love is to listen to them and see them and move toward them the way Jesus did. It wasn't just marginalized that Jesus was sending a message to and about. It was also who he picked to be in his inner circle. The second thing was his choice of disciples was odd. It's odd. Most of the rabbis their habit would be to observe the young boys going to rabbinical school or to the school in the sanctuary where the Pharisees would be teaching, and they would look for the cream of the crop. They would look in the synagogue for these young boys who were smart and bright, and they would invite them out of the school to shun the employment of their fathers, which is what most boys would do, and come to rabbi school. It was every Jewish mother's dream, high prestige. That's not where Jesus went to build his inner circle. First of all, he invited Simon the Zealot and Matthew the tax collector to be in his inner circle. These were two men who were absolutely, philosophically, ideologically opposed to each other. He went to both of them and he said, "Boys, you have nothing in common, okay? In fact, you disagree on almost everything. If you put a Venn diagram down of everything where you're different and you find a little slice of center in the middle, that's me. That's Jesus. That's all you need." Yeah? These guys would perhaps be at the opposite end of a political spectrum. If they were at a political rally, they would probably be hurling bad words and perhaps worse at each other. Jesus intentionally brought them together into his inner circle because Jesus knew the kind of love he made available was powerful enough to overcome all of those differences.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And he wasn't done. Then he selects James and John, which the New Testament calls the sons of, do you remember?
Thunder.
Thunder, the sons of thunder. That would make you think that these were courageous men. No, actually, the Greek word means sons of anger. He brought two brothers on his team who had anger management issues. And a mother who followed them around and kept saying, Jesus, pay attention to my boys, please. He called Peter, who was probably the disciple who was publicly rebuked more than all of the rest put together on his team. I mean, a guy who needed to be spoken to 3 times before he got the point. He invited Judas into his inner circle. Why? Because Jesus was trying to get us to understand that loving people who are just like you doesn't count at all.
Yeah.
In fact, he said it pretty clearly in Luke chapter 6. He says, what credit do you get? What good is it for you if you love people who are like you or lend money who can repay it to you? Do not even the heathens do this? What he's saying is that's love basics. Jesus is inviting us into an uncommon kind of love that recognizes differences. Yes, they do exist. It recognizes them for sure, but deems them secondary or tertiary to the centrality and the supremacy of the kind of love that God offers you and I. And the third thing that Jesus did over and over again in his ministry to show us that there is an uncommon understanding of love that he wants to show us in his movement is he moved them towards servanthood and suffering. Very often in the gospel, Jesus worked so hard and spent so much time with people that it says that sometimes the spirit went out of him. Sometimes he had to get on a boat and push it away and sleep. Sometimes he went missing and you couldn't find him because he was so drawn to servanthood as an expression of the center of the kind of love that God has for us, to disadvantage himself for the sake of another person and to suffer in a multiplicity of ways. Andy Crouch is probably one of the preeminent writers and thinkers about the intersection of culture and Christianity. And he says this, he says, in the early church up until the year 300, when Constantine got a hold of it, the number one conversation the church would have when they came together was, how do we nobly endure suffering for the sake of the gospel? And he goes on to say, he says, we have lost our capacity to have that conversation. And instead, we spend the majority of our time talking about our comforts and our blessings. A blessing. And not that there's anything wrong with that, with those things. But in the life of Jesus, he spoke much less about those things and much more about inviting us to share with him in the sufferings as a sign that we understand this kind of love. This kind of sacrificial life, this kind of uncommon love, that if it ever got released in a compelling way, it would change the world. In 1903, American President Teddy Roosevelt, who was quite a character, okay, he saw for the first time the Grand Canyon. Anybody ever go to the Grand Canyon here? Anybody? In America? It's pretty spectacular. And I love in his journal that he wrote this in response, right? He says, I was completely gobsmacked by it. I don't know if I even have that quote there. I was completely gobsmacked by it. I love that word. I read about a guy who, there it is, a guy who had a son who was about to turn 9. And he decided for his son's birthday that he was going to take him away overnight to see the Grand Canyon for the very first time. Okay? Early in the morning, right before the sun came up, they drove to the parking lot of the Grand Canyon and they leaned over in the car, and he leaned over in the car to his son and he said to his son, do you trust me? It was a good thing his son was 9 and not 14, because he probably would have gotten a very different answer. But his son said, of course, Dad. Of course. He said, great. Come outside. Keep your eyes closed. Hold my hand. Don't open your eyes until I tell you to. And what he does is he walks with his son close to the edge of the Grand Canyon, and waited for that moment when the sunrise came up over the flat top of the Grand Canyon and began to flood with rays the nooks and crannies of the canyon. And he squeezed his son's hand and he said, "Go ahead, open your eyes. Open your eyes." And he said for 90 seconds, it's a long time, by the way. For 90 seconds, he said, my son didn't say a word. And then he squeezed my hand and he looked up at me with tears in his eyes and he said, "Dad, I had no idea. I had no idea." We have no idea of the kind of love that God has, God is, and has made available to us. And that God encourages us by saying, guys, it's not only so good that you cannot even comprehend it, but it never ends. For those of you who are parents, you know there comes a time when you raise your children when they become your teachers as well. Yeah? For most of us, it comes as soon as they're very little, but I have experience with that. I know some of you know one of my kids struggles with anxiety. It's very difficult, and as a parent, you cannot fix it all the time. You cannot do anything but watch your child in such pain. And I want to protect, but I cannot be there all the time. I cannot always make it better. I have to point my kids to Jesus. He can help. He can give them his love, which can help them overcome their anxiety. Yeah? And that's what God does. He offers his love to each of us. Each of us. It's available to us. Let's pray.